Good evening and welcome. My name is Perry Scheinbaum and I'm a program officer here at the Council. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program, A Healthy People and Planet from Action to Change. A quick reminder that tonight's program is on the record and we are live streaming. The Council is an independent and nonpartisan platform. Views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. We welcome your social media engagement, but please take a second to silence your phones. We will be taking questions from the audience as well as through our online survey application. Please type ccga.live into your browser and select today's program. The management of natural resources is critical for planetary health, an emerging discipline focused on understanding the inextricable links between our environment and health. Deforestation, erosion, water scarcity, and climate change are just some of the mounting factors impacting our planet and in turn our health. Several scientific and multilateral reports this year have called for immediate action to implement policies and shift individual habits before it's too late. What can we as individuals do to make a difference, and does it ultimately matter? Tonight we'll hear from experts who study and research these environmental problems and work to better our future. And it's my great pleasure to introduce these panelists. Eduardo Brandizio is a distinguished professor of anthropology at Indiana University, Bloomington, and the director of the Center for the Analysis of Social Ecological Landscapes. Esther Ngumbi is an assistant professor within the Entomology and African American Studies departments at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, studying global food insecurity. Tatiana Schlossberg is a journalist writing about climate change and the environment, where she has previously reported for the science and climate sections of the New York Times. Many of you may have had the opportunity to pick up a copy of her latest book, Inconspicuous Consumption, The Environmental Impact You Don't Know You Have, prior to the program. If you have not, I welcome you to do so after the program. And our moderator for this evening is Earthring Cousin. She is a distinguished fellow of global agriculture at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and previously served as executive director of the World Food Program from 2012 until 2017. Please join me in welcoming our panelists to the stage. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us this evening for what I am going to hope, and we're going to work to deliver a robust and interesting dialogue. I was introduced as having served as the executive director of the World Food Program. And many of you may be familiar with the Green Revolution. How many of you are familiar with the Green Revolution? With the Green Revolution, we took almost 800 million people out of hunger and poverty. But at the time that the investments were made in increasing agricultural productivity, there was little, if any, I would argue, no thought given to the impacts of the agricultural food system changes that we implemented in order to increase the quality and quantity of food that provided for the movement of that large number of people out of hunger and poverty. And as a result, we're now seeing impacts on soils, impacts on aquifers, impacts on air quality by our agricultural food system. And now, as we as a global community have embraced the opportunities to address the challenges of the environment and the impacts of climate change on our environment, there's been a, shall I say, growing interest in understanding the relationship of environment and deforestation and agricultural food systems and human health, and what are the unintended consequences of the particular linear changes that we've made that have made for a better world, that have increased access to food, access to health, access to water, but at what cost? And we've now begun to recognize as a community that we can no longer ignore this. And so we see what was said in the opening as a emerging conversation around and an emerging discipline in many academic institutions around planetary health. In recognizing that we need to make systems changes and structural changes, not just linear changes on one particular issue, but across the entire food system across the how we use our natural resources in order to support both human health and planetary health. And so we have the experts and who are spending their time researching what we need to do, what we've done in the past, the challenges that our actions have created, as well as identifying solutions. And so let's hear from them. Let's start with talking about this emergence of the issues and discipline of planetary health and the recognition of the need for the multi-sectoral changes that are necessary to support planetary as well as human health. And each of you touch on these issues in your work. So I'd like to pose a question to each of you to start this conversation tonight by asking you, what do each of you see as the most pressing environmental issue impacting human health?
So I think climate change is one of the biggest issues of our time. And the reason being, climate change affects our agricultural systems, right from the soil to the plant health to human health. So it's a building up our ecosystem right from beneath our ground, and where many of us never realize that we have billions of microorganisms that are working to ensure that all of us have food and for the next many years. And then those microorganisms impact the plant health. They help plants, first of all, deal with insect pests. We know right now 50% of our crop losses are caused by insect pests. And then climate change continues to manifest itself in repetitive droughts, flooding. We have research that's showing that there's evidence that those beneficial soil microorganisms can actually work with the plants, and they help the plants deal with all these changes that are coming across with climate change. And then we know that at the end of the day, then we have agriculture that supports the bottom billion. Women, I'm talking about youth, that are relying on these systems to work. And so if these systems are not working, then we have the next generation that's not well fed. We all know that there's also science that's showing that the first 1,000 days are most important. So we must ensure that our systems, our plants are delivering the health that our children need to be able to be smart like you and I, and to be able to take the challenges of the future. And then there is also health. So it's quite an interlinked system. And we can never be just siloed. This siloed approach will never work.
So before I go to Eduardo, let me ask you quickly, though. You talked about climate change as that environmental issue that is impacting our food system and as a result impacting human health. What's the answer?
I think it all starts, everyone must take action. Right from you and I that's seated here today. Individual actions. And then it moves on to institutional actions. Then it goes to our leaders. So it's no longer we're waiting for the governments. We are waiting for the people we're waiting for greater to act. It's upon us. Wherever you are, connect to climate change. Find that avenue that you care about that really connects with your discipline. And then let's move from here. And also let's also connect to the science that's currently. What's the most important thing that we can act on? And what does science tell us are the most, where we can get solutions that amplify, that really help solve this challenge and reaches the 9 billion of us?
We're going to come back to that action issue, but let's go to you, Eduardo. What do you see as the...
First, thank you for the introduction. I think you touched on a really important point. Thank you for being here. Really pleasure to be here today and for the invitation. So make 3 points relate to your initial question. We recently did a global assessment on the state of biodiversity and ecosystems that was released last May. And what we found is that when you look across indicators of all environmental conditions, you see globally decline in almost all those indicators, right? So you look at ecosystem extension and integrity, the size of populations, the diversity of different communities, the number of species, of course, and local varieties of crops and animals. So when you look across the globe, you see a trend that is global. And therefore all interrelated and all pressing. When you look at the drivers, you said very well. We did a compilation of the drivers that are driving environmental change globally. Land use change is still today the first driver, followed by direct extraction of resources, followed by pollution, invasive species, and I forgot the fifth one. But you got a sense that there is a hierarchy of drivers that are driving this change. What we don't see is that we're searching for materials farther and farther. So a lot of the time we don't see those changes happening here, but it's the action that we're taking here that are driving changes elsewhere. The second point is that those changes are affecting directly the contributions that nature provides to us, whether we depend directly or indirectly on them. So we did an evaluation of 18 dimensions of direct and indirect contributions of nature to human populations, half of them related to health. And across the planet, you see decline in 14 of those 18 dimensions. The only dimensions that are not declined are the materials that we're getting more and more from the ground. But the consequence, they're all declining. The third point, and what I think is the most pressing, is that those declines and the implications of those declines are unequally distributed. So when you look both internal to different countries, when you see the impact of environmental degradation, of disasters, of different kinds of problems, they affect populations that are already marginalized more. You see this in the US, in terms there are many environmental justice issues that are well documented, and today you see that globally. So the displacement of impact is very unequal globally. And while it's improving in many places, it continues to deteriorate, and the projected changes for the next 10 years is that it will continue to spread, first to Latin America, then to Asia, sub-Saharan Africa now, are the new frontiers of those declines. So, those are the pressing issues that the projected changes are likely to continue, and their impact are very unequal. So they exacerbate existing inequalities.
I could ask you about 10 questions, but I want to go to and ask you the same question. What do you see as the most pressing environmental issue affecting planetary health and human health?
Well, it's hard to pick just one, but I think, I would say in general, the burning of fossil fuels, which, connects to what Esther said about climate change. But, air pollution from burning fossil fuels kills 90,000 people in the US every year. Around the world, it's even more. And I think that we don't kind of think about that as a direct effect on human health. The pollution that we all breathe in from gasoline, or from, if people who live near power plants. The production of fertilizer is an enormous producer of greenhouse gas emissions. And so when you think about the air pollution from that, the water pollution from that, and then how those resources are involved in climate change and kind of connected to all these other health consequences, whether it's nutrition from food or crop failure, or the inability of crops to grow in certain places because of climate change. I think to trace it back to the source, I think there are kind of the direct, immediate human health impacts of burning fossil fuels, as well as kind of the larger problem of climate change.
So whether we're talking about burning fossil fuels or the multitude of environmental impact issues that Eduardo identified for us, or climate change in general, we know these are interdisciplinary challenges that require multi-sectoral solutions. And you all come from very diverse sectors and very different backgrounds, but your answers are addressing these structural challenges that are impacting the environment. So what do you say to people who don't understand how they can work to solve these, what sounds like very difficult systemic issues? Why don't we start with you, Eduardo?
Well, we need to work together. I think that's the first thing I would say. We grew up in a time when science was divided organizationally into departments to deal with different aspects, and that has contributed a lot for us to understand many dimensions. But knowledge has no borders, and we need to remember that when we bring our contribution from entomology, from journalism, from anthropology, it's part of a larger question that we're contributing to. And I think that's part of rethinking the way we think about the environment. I think for a long time we have put a lot of emphasis on the material dimensions and the material consequence of environmental change or the economic aspect of it. And I think we're becoming more sensitive now that it includes a whole range of factors. There are a whole range of psychological, emotional, and health dimensions that need to be considered together when we think about those problems. So it's collaborative work where we bring our expertise to answer larger questions in a collaborative way.
And Tatiana, how do you answer this?
Well, I think my book is directed at a more general audience, and I think one of the problems or the challenges in journalism that I felt when I started writing about climate change and the environment was that there was kind of a problem of the scale of the way that we had this conversation, because it's either hurricanes and forest fires and a complete transformation of the electricity grid in 10 years, or it's the plastic straw, and I think that people don't, that doesn't make sense to people. And so, what I've tried to do in my book and, in general, is to help people understand that we are all connected to climate change all the time, and it's an issue that connects all of us all around the world because of the various effects of the things that we do and buy and wear. So in my book, I wrote about the internet, food, fashion, and fuel. And there has been an emphasis on the material consequences, and I think a lot of responsibility placed somewhat unfairly on the consumer to make a sustainable choice, as opposed to kind of reforming the systems themselves. But I think what I have found resonates with people is bringing the issue of climate change down to the context of their own lives, because I think it's for people who don't study this and who aren't reading about it all the time, it can be really difficult to understand what me using electricity to go online has to do with the burning of fossil fuels in another part of the country, or the health impacts, or a natural disaster impacts people living in other parts of the world. And so I think kind of understanding that this issue is inseparable from basically everything is and kind of doing it on a very accessible level, I found, I hope anyway, works.
We're going to come back to that in 1 second. I want to go to Esther first, though, and get your thoughts.
I think they actually were in my brain, and I've written about it, that we need to broaden the framing of climate change, make it inclusive, make it relatable. Most of the time, it's, as an expert, we write in all these terms. There are jargon. We now know that it's jargon because people can relate with it. How do we ensure that we package the message of climate change so that you, the farmer, the person that's selling things to me, actually feels connected to what's going on? That's for me, it's important. And how do we do that? We have to find ways to ensure that they relate to it. I know there's studies that people don't care until it happens to them. When you've been caught up in, Hurricane Katrina, that's when you know that, okay, that's climate change related. But for most of us, we just think, it's, we look at starving people, think that's just, it's their continent. It's the faraway continent. It's not relatable to me. We have to realize, think of it broadly. Think of it as a foreign issue. I know Chicago Council had a report where they clearly showed that Americans are now connecting to it. They say it's the most critical issue that we have to deal with, and that it's a foreign policy issue, because we're already in the rise of terrorism. So how do we connect everything so that the normal person, the everyday person, understands?
The everyday person understands. That gets us right to your book, Tatiana. And I'm holding up her book. She is on a book tour. Inconspicuous consumption. And in this book, you talk about everything we do, use, or eat has to do with climate change. And you focus on, as you noted in your earlier answer, technology, food, fashion, what we consume. And from your reporting, your research, do you believe that we can make a change? Because let me tell you, I've seen studies where the focus groups have shown and polling data has been very has not supported the statement that people are willing to make change for planetary health. There was a study that was done in London that almost 70% of the participants said they would not change their diet for planetary health. They changed it for their personal health, but not for planetary health. What's your research showing, and what makes a difference in how we talk to people and what they're willing to do to make change to support the planet?
So, my book is about kind of, consumer goods and the things that we use all the time, but it actually is not about individual behavioral change, because I don't think, and I'm not alone in thinking that, individual behavioral changes are not enough to solve this problem. And I think that the narrative of personal responsibility has been destructive, because it's, suggested that, if we only all brought our reusable bag to the grocery store, we wouldn't be in this problem. But also, I think it makes us turn inward and away from the problem, and it also lets those who are actually responsible off the hook. And so, and that's fossil fuel companies and lobbyists and the politicians who take money from them. So, in my book, I've emphasized that these are systems level challenges, and that, I don't believe that it should be on the consumer to make a sustainable choice, not only because that's usually impossible, but also because we don't have the information to be able to do that. If you're standing in the grocery store or buying clothes, it's really hard to know which item was made with the least amount of environmental impact. But somebody does have that information, and that's the person who's making money from this. And so I think, what I emphasize in my book is that these changes need to happen at a higher level. So if all of the products are more sustainable, it's not on the consumer to make the choice between the good thing and, I think light bulbs, for instance, are a good example. If you don't have incandescent bulbs, then people don't have to choose between incandescent and LED. You eliminate the unsustainable choice. So, I think there's some research that shows that, most people say that they would be willing to, that they want to get the more sustainable thing. And then if they're asked if they would pay more for it, they say no. So, I think that that's part of the problem, but that's also because, things that are sustainable have often been expensive and only been affordable for certain people, and that's the problem, because that's not the people who are buying the other things. That's a kind of small section of the population. So, so I think that individual behavioral changes are great in that they, can help remind people of the problem, and I think it's a good place to start. But I think, the individual action we need is individual action like voting, individual action like not supporting a company that doesn't do, that isn't at least transparent about its practices, and also, talking about climate change is a really important individual action. So, so I think that there are kind of those changes that address the structures of the system as opposed to the individual behavioral changes, because I think we all know that that's not enough, or there aren't enough of us doing them for it to make a difference.
And that gets you, Eduardo, right to the work that you've been performing and the research you've been performing around inclusive framing of these issues. And so what does an inclusive framing of an environmental problem look like?
Let me pick on this first, because I very much agree with you. I think you touched the right note in sort of, discussing the issue of the individual responsibility and system responsibility. I mean, the individual has enormous responsibility and has enormous power to change. But as consumers, there's so much that we can do to be able to change systems that have been in place for many years. So I think I really think the framing that you have,
Right.
it's sort of the framing that we need, because it goes not only across levels, the individuals and the larger systems, right, but different dimensions that come together to take the trajectory that we're taking. So anyhow, so it was very, very, very. So think about systems.
I would ask, before
Yeah.
you even get into that, while you're talking about this issue, and the question is, if we move beyond a discussion of individual responsibility, the question becomes, what is the individual responsibility or individual? How do we bring individuals together to support the public will that is necessary to drive the kind of systems changes and structural changes that you've just described? And so if you can build that into your answer as well, and we'll come back to you and let you.
I'll try.
Okay.
But I want to go attention to some of those systems features, I think, that help us to understand that. We need to think that we are in a particular global political economy since after the Second World War. And the environmental issues that we have today are a consequence of those trajectories. Right? So we see after that period, you see what we call a great acceleration. Right? So you see a great acceleration of resource extraction, expanding frontiers, migration, population, all sorts of consumer goods. You name it. I mean, so it's a process of exponential change that we're starting just to cope with now. And we haven't paid much attention to it because we export the degradation. We tend to export. So we look at environmental conditions in the global north, and you see incredible degradation up to the 70s, and then a reversal of that degradation, right? And that is exported to other parts of the world. So what's behind some of that? Cheap nature, cheap labor, right? It's the logic that sort of drives, this is a cheap and lack of regulation, right? So that's one of the aspects that subsidies that favor degradation, right? Instead of discourage or instead of becoming incentives for better practices. A mentality of consumption, of expanding consumption that is based on material goods and growth. And a narrative of economic development that makes degradation and inequality as inevitable and acceptable as part of the goals of economic development. So there are a number of conditions that have been evolving for many years, right, that came to a point where the scale of degradation became global. And now we're dealing with a saturation of those problems that require us to rethink that we can not only deal with those problems here where we live and where we can pay. Right? The problems have become at a scale that now there needs coordination at a broader level. Now, because of the diversity of such a diverse society that we have different perspectives to it. So how you frame the issue, right? How you connect the issue to the lives of people in different ways makes a difference on how people get engaged in the voting process, in social movements, and engage in their regions, to make those changes happen in the way that affect them, but also have a large consequence.
And Esther, I want to come to you because we talk about how people get engaged and the changes that they make and the changes in systems. And so often what the data shows and what the evidence demonstrates is true is that those who are the most vulnerable people living in the poorest places are the ones who are most detrimentally impacted by the changes that we're talking about. And so when we start talking about systems changes, we're talking about making changes in systems that will affect how people grow and consume in places where they didn't create the problems. And so when you are working on food security and agriculture issues in these communities, how do you build activism in those communities where they are the victims of everything that we're talking about here, but too often, and not they were not the cause, and yet we see that the funding that is necessary to support the kind of changes that we're talking about is not coming forward. So how do you work with the youth and activists in these areas to build voice, and what are the arguments that you use to create the support that is necessary for driving the change that's required in these communities?
So that's a very good question, and building on just, first of all, I think of the perfect example is the late Nobel Prize winner, Professor Wangari Maathai, how she built her movement. She went down to the people. And first of all, you hear about their voice. You don't reach out as if you're an expert. You take a seat back and listen. Listen to their concerns, and then from there, find a creative and authentic way that really allows them to realize, okay, we are victims, yes, but we can no longer just sit back and claim the victim. We have to rise up and use whatever is around us to provide solutions. And so, yes, I get to the communities, listen to the women. They know best. They've lived in these communities for many years. We don't, I always say, we don't know. We just need to listen. And from listening, then we merge our opinions, we merge the solutions, and we move forward. And then they have a buy-in. They know now we're dealing with climate change. It's up. They see it every day. Of course, they experience it. They've seen it. I work in Kenya, and I talk to my parents. I grew up in the Kenyan coast. It used to be hot. It's no longer hot. They see these changes. But how then we start working together? Their technology, science is evident. And then we ensure that their voice, and they also you have to buy in the cultural, because I know as growing up as a woman, my voice was silenced. And probably you'll encounter other voices that are silenced. So you have to find the context of wherever you are. You cannot just go in and just decide this is how it worked in Latin America. So everything varies. And it's those little things that we ignore that really make a difference. When they own it, when they know it's their problem, they will march to the governments. They will demand the change that is needed. And that's always my approach. And the youth, we know that once they know it's our challenge, they rise up to the occasion. And they are persistent. We know of Greta. I mean, I always imagine her when she started the movement by herself in her corner, and look where it is. So also, and also letting them know that it can be lonely as well. They may face also challenges. Most of them come from governments that may try to shut them down. But you have to be more.
So let's go to our audience and bring them into this conversation on the issues related to environmental health and the changes that are required. And I see a question right here in front.
Gather was science that the last time there was this much carbon in the atmosphere, the temperature was 5 degrees hotter than it is now, and the oceans were 50 feet higher than they are now. Is anyone looking into how we cope with a situation like that?
How we cope with, like, if it warms by 5 degrees Celsius?
It looks as if that's possible.
Definitely. I mean, I think most climate science, I mean, most people who are doing projections of climate science build in scenarios for 2 degrees of warming, 5 degrees of warming. 8.5, I think, is kind of the upper limit of what they model for. So yes, there are lots of what the temperature will be it will vary in different places because that's usually an overall average surface temperature there.
Everyone has to move out of Florida, for instance. Do you know how to cope with Florida disappearing?
Well, I think that, I don't think that there's been enough attention paid to how we actually adapt beyond kind of, and that's because, in this country, for the most part, we have not had climate refugees. There's one community in Louisiana and another in Alaska that have moved because of, rising sea levels or melting ice or subsidence. So I think, we don't pay enough attention to like the economic and cultural impacts of something like that happening. But, insurance companies are increasingly looking at that, kind of how they'll insure and those sorts of things. So there are, but I don't think kind of at the scale that we need.
Many of the small island nations are developing plans for the disappearance of their lands, and the movement of whole populations from where they live today. Are any of you want to speak to that in specific?
The issue is, to me, is not to think about the climate itself, but how it interacts with the social conditions that we have. And I think that is where the challenge is today, because you look at a significant sector of the population, let's say in the Global South, where I study, you now have moved most of that population to urban areas. You look at the conditions of those urban areas, and it's significantly, statistically significant different in terms of infrastructure, service, pollution conditions than we have here, for instance. So the conditions that you already have conditions that are very sensitive. So it doesn't need to get to 5 degrees. Small events, small changes, systemic events create already conditions that are putting people on the border, even more to the border. So I think we need to think about that we already have a problem without thinking scenarios very extreme for climate change. Any scenario in climate change now is exacerbating that problem at a scale that we haven't had. So it's looking together into the inequality, into the social difference, into the lack of infrastructure that we have. With or without climate change, I would say,
Right.
creating conditions that are, I would say, unacceptable.
Yeah, I think that's so important to remember that there are people who are suffering at the moment. So, we can't, there's a lot of, often a lot of talk about not wanting to get to 2 degrees or things like that, which are, important targets, but we also, we can't wait really any longer because there are people who are, in the Global South disproportionately indigenous, Black, brown people who are already kind of bearing the impacts of a problem that they didn't create. So, so there is, there's that level of urgency also.
So let's go to online for a quick question, and it's a little political. What are your thoughts on the Green New Deal, and does it take us in the right direction, or is it only a baby step in the right direction? Anyone?
Well, I think it's a step in the right direction in that it has changed the conversation rather dramatically in terms of what at least Democrats are willing to consider as climate action. I think we had not really talked beyond a carbon tax in this country, and the Green New Deal has really changed that conversation, and I think made at least all the presidential candidates kind of understand, or at least begin to address that this is, this affects every kind of level of our society and our economy. So I think in that way, it is great. I think, there's not a ton of really specific policy in it, which is a problem. But I think it's kind of aspirational in an important way.
I see a hand back here in the back. Go ahead.
Hi. So I really appreciated your stress on not overemphasizing individual consumer choices. But related to, Tatiana, your internet focus and sort of that broader, not one person can ever change these things, how do we as citizens weigh changes in systems? I'm thinking about how there was a huge push to go paperless, but that means an increase in use of electronics, which use energy. That means more server space. And how are those being powered? So how do we evaluate what systems we adopt?
It's a good question. I mean, there are trade-offs for everything. And what you mentioned is like the rebound effect, which is, an example that I write about in the book. In 2011, there was a study that was evaluating the relative efficiency of streaming video versus like buying or renting a DVD from a store, which included the production of the DVD and also driving to the store to get it. And so at that time, streaming video was much more efficient. And we watched that year 3.2 billion hours of video. In 2017, we watched 114 billion hours of video. So we've kind of canceled out a lot of the gains that we've made. So I think that you have to. It's an important lesson in kind of understanding how all these things work together. But I think in general, there are going to be trade-offs for no matter what we do. And so I think as individuals, in terms of what you can do, I think it's important to think, as Esther said, like you pick the thing that you care about and you work on that, because you can't address everything, and there is no silver bullet. So, but it is a really good question.
Because that touches very well on the issue of framing that you said, and what you said, it's very right. I think we're still incipient in our science of understanding nexus and trade-offs and spillovers, in part because we have done that science from different perspectives, from different disciplinary perspectives, paying attention on one side without understanding the interactions, right? It's like treating the body without treating the mind kind of idea. And that's a science that is emerging only now. And that's why we need so much collaboration, dialogue, listening, and getting perspective from different stakeholders to frame the problem, to understand the problem and its complexity, without this sort of, single side perspective.
And I think also universities, like we are mandated to train and to be the center for knowledge. I think our universities or places of institutions of higher learning or any college has a mandate to share this information. And it's important that we communicate as scientists, as experts, or as an individual, so that the consumer doesn't have to think, how do I gauge? So that there is that, real-time access, and so that you're thinking of something, you have a website where you can do all these calculations. So I think it's also will fall part of the institutions of higher learning that we have the need to serve and to ensure that people that are having these questions can find the answers.
Down front here. Go ahead. No, you. Go ahead.
Well, there's lots of questions, but first of all, the health. I haven't heard anybody really talk about health, like human health. And what a gentleman said towards the beginning of those who, the most degradation or the most abuse ends up impacting the people who least can handle it. Also, as far as health, just simple choices. The idea of clothing, of fashion, I think I'm realizing it's gigantic. How many clothes I get that I don't need or use much. I mean, that has to be huge. But as far as food, if we don't decide on our own, if someone like McDonald's tries to feed people fruit instead of potatoes, and then everyone rises up and says, my kid's going to eat potatoes, and they won't eat that other stuff, we're throwing it away. How can the government or policy, or how do we, who can impact our choices? If it's not us, then what, do you see where I'm going with this? We need policies that are better, but in the United States, people think that policies that demand something of us that we don't want are socialism or communism or dictate, and so how do we make peace with those two things?
We'll take that question. Let's grab one more, and then, because we're going to run out of time, and I want to give many people a chance. So the question of policies and demand, and how do we change demand in a way that positively affects human health as well as environmental health? Okay, here.
The Dominican Republic and Haiti are on the same island.
Mm-hmm.
They have the same climate.
Mm-hmm.
They have the same problems. They're both democracy. How come one is poor, one is rich?
Okay. Okay, so we have the policies in demand, and we have the challenges of the Dominican Republic and Haiti. That should make for a robust dialogue. How about it, folks? All right. Who wants to take on either one of those?
That's a hard one. I'm not a specialist on Haiti or the Dominican Republic, but they both have a long history of colonialism. And that history, sort of has impacted their ability to control and to develop their own institutions. In Haiti, in particular, you have a series of coups, and so there's so many disruptions that when interacting with other issues like environmental degradation, which is a problem that they face for a long time because of deforestation, or the natural events and so forth, that exacerbate those conditions that have been developing for at least a couple of centuries. So. Right. I think it has a much longer historical root than the conditions that we see there today.
And I don't want to. We'll just. I'll say that we can spend the balance of the time talking about the challenges of Haiti versus Dominican Republic, but in our conversation here today, I think even in the Dominican Republic, with the positive agricultural productivity that they've had in recent history, they are now being impacted as well by changes in climate, and it is affecting their agricultural output in a significant way. And so to our conversation today, while their impact is not as grave as that of Haiti, which has a lot more political, is much more of a political and governance conversation than an environmental and health conversation. Both of them are now being affected by climate change, and the poor agricultural productivity in Haiti to a greater degree, but the Dominican Republic is not without impact. And we'll move on to the next question.
Sure, I think the question about changing demand and changing attitudes and behavior is a really difficult one to address, particularly in America. But I think that there's also a lot of room to be made. First of all, I'll say Americans per capita eat a lot less beef than we used to, for instance. We eat kind of as a population the same amount, but there are a lot more of us. So there are changes to our diet that are happening. But I also think that there are kind of systems level changes that really need to happen. Many people eating less red meat, for instance, doesn't necessarily change the fact that in the U.S., 67% of our crop calories don't feed people. And that's not changed by individual behavior. That's changed by changing that system where most of our agriculture is corn and soybeans. And we're a net exporter of food because we export that to the rest of the world. So, changing those things also goes a really long way towards, I think, changing kind of how our food system works, and also, would have cascading benefits in terms of, rural drinking water, which is affected by fertilizer, which a lot of goes to growing corn and soybeans, or, in the Gulf of Mexico, all these things. So I think that yes, of course, we need to kind of change our behavior, because if the rest of the world eats meat the way America does, we're in trouble, even more trouble. But I also think that there are kind of reforms on that level that are really important. And it's a difficult conversation to have, especially because, the first contest in the presidential primary is in Iowa, which grows a lot of corn, which makes things difficult. But we were talking before about subsidies. These things all kind of work together, and so it's not just a question of changing demand. I think that's kind of what I try to emphasize.
There was a hand over here. Go ahead.
Level. Recently, I was kind of excited that our streetlights were getting to be LED lights, which are brighter and seem safer. Then you start digging in and reading that the Kelvin and the blue lights have health issues, dangerous for light pollution as well. And obviously, the city probably made some budgetary factors in terms of choosing the type of Kelvin, the cheaper blue lights. Who's evaluating this? And this is a local level, I was excited at first, and now I'm not sure if I really want to walk my dog at night because I might not sleep very well.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that problem in particular, but you know, I think it's some of what we were talking about before in terms of kind of what the relative trade-offs are for the things that we use, and you know, and the changes that we make that we think have a positive climate impact and end up, you know, causing problems. Like a really good example is the kind of shift to diesel in Europe, which was thought to have a lower greenhouse gas benefit, but results in the pollution of a lot more particulate matter, which is harmful to human health. So, you know, so I do think, you know, I don't know about that issue specifically, and I'm not an expert on blue light, or I mean, I look at health impacts kind of more generally as opposed to, and you know, from things like air pollution, water pollution, things like that. So I don't know about that, but I think it's a, you know, a small example and an important example of the different kind of trade-offs and considerations, and when we're thinking about climate versus kind of other problems.
And I come back to all three of you, because I think that does raise an important issue at a different level about the multi-sectoral impact of one change and the blind spots that we often find when we make change. How do we create the interdisciplinary conversations and policy development that is necessary to address some of those unintended consequences of change that we make?
I really like the example. I don't know anything about the example, but what it raised to me is that, first, there are no magical solutions. I think that's the first thing. You know, when we think of technology that may have the potential to, you know, create a tipping point in something, without understanding how it works, you know, without taking a precautionary principle. And I think that's the issue here. How do we move in a way that we understand the consequence and we move along in an adaptive way, you know, without making significant shifts, hoping that will be the magic bullet to solve other problems. And it's a really good example. I'll make, you know, in terms of time, I'll make sort of 3 points that I think, at least in my view, connect some of those issues. The nature of the problem, much of this problem is global in many ways. So there are many of those issues that require global coordination, and we cannot go away from, you know, developing that level of political investment in global coordination to deal with some of those issues. I think we have a great example on the Montreal Protocol, right, to deal with the ozone layer is an example where individuals became mobilized all the way to government, to international coordination, to industry, in a way that collaboration and the narrative of the ability that together that problem could be resolved resulted in sort of, you know, at least a positive outcome. So it's an example that I think, you know, we need to think more. The second level, it's place-based coordination. And I think here you have a fantastic example of you know, the need and the potential for that. You cannot deal with the Great Lakes from the perspective of Chicago. It's a system that, as a system that has a global connection, just like the Amazon where I work, but it's a system that is international, interdependent, and interconnected. So it requires cross-sectoral, international collaboration across many sectors to be able to deal with the problems that we see today. You know, the algae blooms that are being experienced in Lake Erie at the level, it's a consequence of connectivity and requires the agriculture, the industry, freight, you know, all sorts of interactions. Invasive species, here's another example. So the Great Lakes is a great example of that intermediate level where global issues make a difference in individual and administrative, and, you know, all the actors can come together and help to problems that are very concrete, I think, in a place-based way, but it's still in a regional and global relevant. And the individual cuts across all those levels, right? As a citizen, as a voter, as a consumer, right? And so forth and so forth. So, yeah, those things are interconnected. I think, you know, as I said, the Great Lakes is a great example where we see those connectivity. We also see the potential because there's a capital here. There's a social capital that between the US and Canada, in fact, that is priceless in the context that we are. Many of other systems that have the same level of connectivity and problems do not have that history of collaboration. right? But that now needs to be taken to the agricultural sector, the industries, the urban areas, right? So, the planning together can help to solve and maintain the integrity, the beauty, and the contributions of this region, for instance, to the larger population of the region.
And I think I will add on that. As we make the connections, I think it's important that we also understand where would it impact most. So think of agriculture. It's supported by women. And think of these women are taking, and then we have the children, where if they're not healthy, we are fueling in a generation that's going to be unhealthy. So making sure that once we collaborate, we put our emphasis to those that need the tools now. We know that school feeding works. You work with World Food Program. Ensuring that children, wherever they are, have healthy food, because we need healthy individuals. Tackling the problems of our challenges of our time, climate change and many others, require people that have functioning brain, they're healthy. We need that. So we must ensure that as we collaborate here, we know where do we put the resources. And it's needed now, because otherwise it will be too late for you and I to act.
Can I say something about that, back to the streetlights? I think in general, we over-rely on technology, and we want to deploy technology that seems like it will fix the problem, as opposed to kind of fully understanding how the technology works with our systems. And I think you can kind of see that sometimes when people talk about, we'll have a technological solution to climate change in terms of carbon capture and storage, or geoengineering, all these different things. So I think it's a kind of a small but important example of how we have to we can't just kind of deploy technology without understanding how people interact with it.
So understanding how people interact with it gets me to my closing question that I'd like to give to each one of you. We've talked about lots of challenges and the different methodologies for addressing those challenges. We've also articulated a number of the problems and the people who are impacted by those problems. I'd like to each one of you to give your thoughts on what gives you hope for our planet and for our future, that all of the things that we're talking about, that we can actually make the kind of change that is necessary to address the challenges in a timely fashion to avoid the problems that have been projected if we don't.
First of all, I think everyone that's in this room gives me hope. You showed up, and we're talking about, and you listened to us. That's very commendable. And that is being live screened. Okay, everybody else that's out, they are tuning in. We appreciate that. And it also gives me hope that people like I, who was born in Kenya, doesn't have to wait until the help, the system-wide help that may never trickle down to my community. I am doing something to move the needle forward. It gives me hope that there's greater, that is saying, hey, I may be young, but it's a human rights issue. You have to look at us. We will not have another planet. We don't have a planet B. This is what is there, and we will protect it. We will talk with you. We will interact with you and make you understand that it's there. Those things give me hope. And that also we have the governments, the universities, the science. I'm a scientist. Every day I go to the lab, I know that I'm moving the needle forward, finding solutions, data-based evidence. Of course, I know by the time I find it, it's moved. Things adapt. I work with insects. By the time we get to know the solutions, they've adapted. So it keeps me on my toe every day.
So you have the hope. Eduardo, what gives you hope?
Well, this year in particular, we invested a lot of time into doing a global assessment, for instance, and the response was tremendous. What I saw as a result of that and many other efforts, that there's a critical mass that is emerging, right? That looks at the problem and sees that it's a collective problem. And that is sort of motivating people to change. I had one of the most interesting experiences about 2 weeks ago. when colleagues at my university organized a meeting between scientists and evangelicals. And it was one of the best meetings I have been, because in spite of our different perspectives, we're talking about climate change issues, right? And bringing our perspective to contribute to move forward. So when, as scientists, we're talking about particular types of solutions, the group of pastors and people, they were talking about creation care, a different framing about the same issue that mobilized them in a way that really motivates them and bridge the political division that has been falsely created, right? In name of vested interests. So that gives me a lot of hope. There's a lot of conversions that even from different perspectives, we can come, and bringing what we can bring to help solve some of those
The
problems.
convergence from different perspectives gives you hope. And Tatiana?
I think the youth climate march, the youth climate strike, that the whole movement gives me faith that there are people who care and who want to do something and who aren't going to wait around for something to be done for them. I also, I don't know what it was like before the EPA existed. I was born in 1990, but when I look at pictures of what America used to be like, I'm so glad that I don't live then. And so and those sorts of things. The expansion of the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act. Those things didn't happen by accident. Those things happened because Americans, 20 million Americans participated in the first Earth Day, and lots of people voted in the 1970 midterm election to defeat members of Congress with bad environmental voting records. And so. I think people these youth climate marches demonstrate to me that, people have faith in government, even though that's difficult at the moment sometimes, but also that people are willing to pay attention because, a clean environment, clean air, clean water, a healthy planet doesn't happen by accident, and it takes a lot of work. And the fact that there are people willing to do that work gives me hope or faith that will figure something out.
Gives you faith and hope. And I wish I could, but we're going to need to wrap it up. Let's go. Let me thank you, Tatiana Schlossberg, and your new book, Inconspicuous Consumption, The Environmental Impact You Don't Know You Have. And if you, there are copies of the book available in the back, and she will be signing books, and I hope you'll all pick up one before you leave tonight. Eduardo Brandizzo, let me thank you for coming with us tonight. I wish I had more time to give to all of you because your comments enlightened me, and I know enlightened our audience. And of course, Esther Ngumbi. You're straight from Kenya, but you're now here ensuring that the voices of the people who are most detrimentally impacted by the changes in the environment that you've outlined for us today, that their voices are heard. And so we appreciate you being here tonight to deliver those messages. And to all of you here in our audience, thank you for joining us. And those online, we appreciate you very much. I apologize to all of you whose questions I didn't get to, both in the audience and online. Our guests are here, and they're happy to answer your questions. Thank you again on behalf of the council for being here tonight.